If we look at 2023, I think there was a major dengue outbreak that affected Bangladesh, and it's still affecting Bangladesh, maybe not as severely. And if we also take a look at Bangladesh, we see that climate change is something that, as time passes, becomes more and more impactful in Bangladesh. And Bangladesh is, in fact, the 7th most affected country in the world from climate change. But climate change was not really mentioned in the run-up to the election. How much or how important do you think climate change and the dengue outbreak were in the run-up to the election?
As far as the election was concerned, not important at all, sadly. These are, obviously climate change is an existential issue for Bangladesh. There is no question about that. The dengue outbreak, if I take it a bit, sort of from a broader perspective, Bangladesh, one thing that is seldom realized about Bangladesh is that it is a very low taxing country, right? The government in Bangladesh is very small. They collect something like about less than 10% of GDP in taxes, 8 or 9%. In other subcontinental countries, even in Pakistan, that number is about 15. In India, once you count in all the state and sort of different levels of government, it gets much higher, right? So in Bangladesh, government collects very small amount in taxes, and therefore it spends very little. So if we look at things like health expenditure, if we look at sort of health system, healthcare, right? There is not really much by way of public provision. There is a private market for the rich, and there is also historically over the years large NGO sector, and they have provided a lot of healthcare at the grassroots level, and this is why you see things like sort of reduction in infant mortality and so on, right? So sort of there is those development gains, and over the years we have also seen things like vaccination and so on. But what we understand in anywhere else in the world in terms of public provision of healthcare, that is very weak in Bangladesh because the government doesn't collect much by way of taxes. So these are existential issues for the country. However, as far as the election was concerned, these things didn't matter at all, factored in at all.
If we look at the tax to GDP ratio, what measures do you think the government could take to increase the tax collection? Right now, I think it's at 8%. That's the official number.
That's the official number. Yes. Yeah. So the measures that they could take and the measures that they could take technocratically versus measures that they could take politically are two very different things. So it's not just that it's 8%, sort of is the official number. If you also look at the composition of those taxes, it's mainly coming from taxes on consumption, either through a value-added tax, it's kind of like a goods and services tax, which is a consumption tax, or taxes on trade, imports, and excises and so on. There is not really much by way of collections from income taxes, whether that is taxes on individual incomes, personal income tax, or corporate income tax. So what we have in Bangladesh is not just a very low tax to GDP ratio. The taxes that are collected are only from from indirect taxes, from consumption and so on. That basically means that if you have to pay taxes, you pay a very high rate. Whereas if you can get away by not paying taxes, you don't pay much at all. So there is a huge distributional issue here. And that solution is not a technocratic solution. The technocratic solution would be that, look, sort of you give the tax collection agencies more power, you upgrade their systems and all of those things. That doesn't really get you much. What is needed is a fundamental political reform that would allow the government to raise new taxes, and that is not forthcoming.
Okay, thank you, sir. But if we were to take a look at the governmental agencies that they've set up in collaboration with international organizations in relation to climate change, I think the government's established the Bangladesh Climate and Development Platform with help from the IMF, World Bank, and ADB.
Yes.
How much do you think collaboration with these developmental organizations can help in fighting the impact of climate change in Bangladesh?
So there are three elements to this. One is that adapting to climate change. All right. So climate change is already happening. So there's that question of grassroots adaptation. So we're talking about things like salinity in the southern part of the country, sort of water becoming, sort of less drinkable and so on, right? So, more increased increased frequency, prevalence of natural disasters and their severity. So adapting to those things. There is actually, Bangladesh has over the years have made tremendous progress in combating natural disasters. So even before climate change was an issue, Bengal Delta would always get flooded. Like, if we go back to, as far back in our history, if you go back to sort of the Middle Ages and, sort of read, Bangla poems and classics, they talk about flood, they talk about, sort of river erosion and all of that, right? So, there is a lot of indigenous knowledge, but also in the 70s, sort of in the 70s, there were a lot of, because of the war and the aftermath of the war, there was, sort of a famine and all of that. Coming out of that, there was tremendous work at the grassroots level through the NGOs and successive governments working with international agencies that, sort of made floods and other natural disasters less, their impacts less severe on human well-being, sort of day-to-day living. That work continues in the form of climate change adaptation. And there's a lot of, collaboration with the international agencies, and that can do tremendous good, right? So that's one, adaptation. Then the other part is transition from fossil fuel to renewables. This, again, can be very useful if there is political will and if there is political decision. Sadly, Bangladesh has gone backwards in this, right? If anything, if we look at the data, it seems that the country has become more reliant on coal, more reliant on fossil fuels, right? This is a policy decision, and government has to take the decision to move away from fossil fuels. If that decision is taken, then working with climate agent, international agencies and so on could be hugely beneficial. And then thirdly, and related to those two, right, is taking advantage of the green economy or make the development trajectory more sort of carbon friendly, climate change, adapted to climate change and so on. Well, that is dependent on the first two. On one front, Bangladesh is doing actually pretty well and probably should continue to do well, which is the adaptation at the grassroots level. But the other one, which is the transition away from fossil fuels, not so well.
If we look at renewable energy, as you just mentioned, I think at COP28, Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina had made a promise as part of the Global Renewables and Energy Efficiency Pledge to double the energy efficiency improvements from 2% to 4%. How realistic do you think this target is for Bangladesh? By 2030, sorry.
Sure, yeah. I don't think that's a very realistic target at all. I think this was sort of made. Look, there is you cannot address climate change without working with Bangladesh. As you mentioned, this is one of the most severely affected countries. It's probably the most severely affected large country by way of population. There are other countries that are more affected in the sense that there are small island nations where probably 100% or 90% of the population are going to be affected in that sense, right? But if you look at the absolute number, right, Bangladesh has 170 million people by official census, right? So the absolute number is huge that are going to be affected by climate change. So there is no way globally we can address climate change without taking Bangladesh into consideration. But at the same time, for Bangladesh to get, sort of a part of that action, it has to make some right noises. And that commitment I would put is as one of those, I tick a box, right? That like, the government has to say the right things so that there is, sort of, yeah.
All right. So if we move on from climate change per se, and we look at the backbone of the Bangladesh economy, which I think can be found in the RMG sector, we've seen, if we can talk about labor arbitrage, how that has benefited Bangladesh in the past and allowed their economy to progress by shifting labor and production to Bangladesh. But last year, we saw the strike from workers in the RMG sector. And you've written an article in Scroll where you mention the economic challenges facing Bangladesh in the garment sector. How do you think the government can address the issues of inflation, labor unrest, and eroding real wages to ensure sustainable growth?
That's a great question. So let's, sort of take through that, step by step. So yes, labor arbitrage and or like, sort of the, in that, in a sense, the Bangladesh's development trajectory for last 30, 40 years is, it started out as very much a, sort of in the footsteps of East Asian countries, right? Got large labor sector, large rural labor. You move them to the cities and they work in factories, right? And you start with very low value added, sort of low wage, low value added sector, such as ready-made garments, such as footwear, and so on, right? So that was the first step. What we have actually seen in Bangladesh, however, is that it hasn't progressed much beyond that. So if we compare, say, for example, with Vietnam, right? 15, 20 years ago, they were probably at a similar stage. But since then, Vietnam has actually started moving on to the next things, right? So they are not making smartphones, but they are making components of smartphone that goes into, sort of, so they're not making chips, but they're making other things. Sort of Samsung has a huge, establishment there. These things haven't happened in Bangladesh, hasn't happened. If we look at female employment, for example, right? Now, Bangladesh has, relatively speaking, higher female workforce participation than India or Pakistan. Sure. And Bangladesh government touts that a lot, that look, sort of social development, blah, 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 right? But again, if we compare that with Vietnam, if we compare that with other East Asian countries that had gone through this stage, Bangladesh still lags behind, right? So, and why is that? Now, there are two parts to this. One is that the unused labor, or that labor surplus labor in Bangladesh remains big. That's because Bangladesh is a larger country than Vietnam. It is a much larger country than South Korea was, 50 years ago, right? We're talking about 170 million people, whereas in South Korea, if you go back to the 70s, they probably had something like 35 million or so. So it's an order of magnitude difference. So that is one part of it. That is a much larger population base, much larger pool of labor that you need to bring in. To overcome this, I mean, like, so if you leave it to the market forces, then this is going to take a much longer, right? Because there is surplus labor that is unused. If you want to overcome this, then arguably there is a role for activist policy, right? Basically, you need to upgrade the labor force, you need to invest in education, you need to invest in human capital, but also you need to sort of attract foreign investment. You need to direct that investment to certain sort of trajectories and so on, right? You cannot leave it just to the market forces, because if you do, there is a long way to go, right? The government has not done either of those things. It doesn't have the money to spend on education and upgrading and all of that because of the tax issue, but also it hasn't pursued the activist investment policies because of the political economy of the country, where sort of it's easier to make money by making connections and sort of investing in mega projects, infrastructure projects, right? So, sort of if you are a rich person, that, that kind of political connection and that kind of sort of building shiny things is easier both for you and the government. Whereas, sort of activist industry policy that directs, sort of investment to certain things where you need to actually produce things and sell in a globally competitive export market, that is much more risky, right? So neither of these, so the government hasn't done any of those things. What that basically means is that the pool of labor, sort of exists. Garments, they thrive, but it doesn't really sort of percolate down or trickle down as much as, because you leave it to the market, competition pressure is still there. The owners can still get by with low wage. In this mix, we have had the inflation shock of the last couple of years. That's a global shock. But the result has been that sort of real wage has gone backwards. For many people, the real wage has gone backward to about 10 years ago, right? Sort of if you take the money wage and if you adjust it for purchasing power, then for many people, many of the workers, things were where they were in 2013, 14. And sort of that's not a sustainable mix, and sort of and people are angry. So that's essentially the issue. What can the government do? In the short run or immediately, the government's biggest priority is to get inflation to sort of a more sort of stable, more moderate rate. In Bangladesh, that usually has meant 5-6%. Now it's running at about 10%. So that the sort of restoring that sort of macro stability is the first priority. But beyond that, the kind of structural reforms that we're talking about, these are difficult things. And again, sort of it requires a government with strong political commitments and political will and mandate to do these things.
Well, if we see 84% of total export earnings come from the textile and ready-made garment industry in
Yes.
Bangladesh, do you think that nearshoring is a problem? Because as you know, the major markets for Bangladesh are Canada, UK, EU, and US. But I read recently that maybe Turkey is being seen as a viable alternative to extracting all the production here and having it in places like Turkey and places around, which would, do you think that would make it harder for Bangladesh in the future in the export market? Or do you think nearshoring isn't a problem?
At least as far as the garments itself, probably not, because the labor is still so much cheaper, right? So even let's assume that sort of the inflation problem is tackled, sort of through macroeconomic policies, right? And yeah, sort of there is still such a pool of unused labor that sort of the sector would probably remain competitive, just garments. However, on moving beyond garments, if the country is to move to the next round of things, nearshoring could be a problem. Again, sort of the government needs to, there needs to be activist policy to avoid that.
So if we're talking about the heavy reliance on the textile and RMG industry, what measures do you think the government can take to diversify their ability to export, could say?
Sure. So the country does not actually attract much by way of foreign investment at all, right? So if you look at if you do comparison with again, sort of Vietnam is a readily applicable comparison, but also other countries that had gone through this kind of trajectory. Right? There aren't any big brand manufacturers in Bangladesh, globally, sort of global brands that have come to Bangladesh. And this is not necessarily because the country is more corrupt or any of those things. I mean, those are sort of Vietnam or China or other Southeast Asian countries were not paragon of good governance when they went through this phase, right? So this is not because of corruption or governance or any of those things. It is basically that sort of why would they come? If I put it that way, that sort of why would you come to Bangladesh when you have a setup already in Vietnam, right? So this, sort of investment, foreign direct investment tend to go where there is already an existing network. There's already, sort of this forces of agglomeration kind of thing, right? Bangladesh does not have that. It needs to create that, right? How can you create that? So you need to have dedicated attention given to the labor force, right? Like, you need to spend money on upgrading and upskilling and all of those things, right? And that requires, that requires money, and government doesn't have that money. So I go back to that fundamental problem, right? So these kind of structural reforms would require, sort of longer term commitments and also mandate, because, if you are going to raise taxes, which is what you really need to do, then, sort of you need to have the political capital to do that. And you have to raise taxes of the elite. You have to raise taxes of the affluent part of the society. Yeah.
If we look at FDI more closely, the government seems to be, at least from what I read, they seem to be actively working on FDI by trying to create a more business-friendly environment through the use of, I think they've created a one-stop service and the setting up of, let's say, special economic zones for different investors. Say, most recently, I read that for the UK, they've allotted a special economic zone. How effective do you think these measures are in attracting foreign direct investment?
So the proof of the pudding is in the eating, right? So we haven't seen, sort of any big brands actually coming in, right? So, and there is a sense that, setting up a special economic zone in and of itself is going to, but sort of that's probably a misreading of the literature on special economic zones, right? So when those zones were done in countries like Vietnam and China and so on, right? The issue was that those countries were formally socialist, communist countries where private property was, if not illegal, frowned upon and all of that, right? So they created those special zones by basically saying that, hey, look, in this enclave, you can have private property and all of those things, right? That's not really the case in the subcontinent, right? It's sort of Bangladesh is no more socialist than India is socialist, right? Therefore, creating that zone in itself is not going to give you that big bang that sort of in China or Vietnam they're sort of that they receive. So that sort of, so in that sense, I'm not really so so upbeat about sort of what these things could achieve, right?
Well, if we look at rising inflation as a problem, as you said, due to external shocks like the Russia-Ukraine conflict, we have the conflict in the Middle East. These are all external shocks. The government has said they aim to reduce inflation down to about 6% by June. What specific measures do you think they would need to take to help in reducing this inflation?
Sure. That's a good question. So yes, the initial spike in inflation that we saw in 2022 was an externally driven thing, right? So it was the part of it was oil in the aftermath of Russian invasion. Part of it was food prices. Part of it was globally rising, sort of prices everywhere, right? Because of the post-COVID supply shocks. In Bangladesh, on top of these, two other things happened. One was that Taka depreciated by a lot, by much more than other similar countries. So official exchange rate was something like 83, 84 Taka per US dollar in the beginning of 2022. In the current market, or in the sort of so there's this the official rate, and then there is the curb market rate, which is basically what you would get if you actually sort of try to go and buy dollar or sell dollar in the market, right? So in 2022, the official rate was about 83, 84. Curb market was probably 85, 86. So there's sort of a small gap, and that's how it had been in the past. Since then, even the official rate has gone to something like about 110 until recently, right? And the current market rate probably had at some point gone even as high as 125, 26. And then there is the black market rate, which is probably even higher. So this depreciation was a big deal. It's much more than what other similar countries, for example, in India or anywhere else, sort of happened. Yes, Pakistan and Sri Lanka probably had even much worse, but those countries were actually in the throes of crisis. So if you leave them aside, Taka has actually depreciated more, much more than non-crisis Asian countries. Part of the, so, part of the reason for this was actually government policy missteps, right? When the US dollar was appreciating very strongly in 2022, and therefore all the other currencies were depreciating, instead of just basically riding that or basically allowing Taka to depreciate, government tried old-fashioned, 1970s style severe import restrictions, right? There were basically restrictions on importing a lot of items. And this doesn't work. It didn't work in back then in many countries. It didn't really work here either. What these import restrictions actually did was basically it did two things. One, it contributed more to inflation because it creates more local supply chain bottlenecks, right? And secondly, people could see that government is doing all of these things because they want to keep the Taka stable, right? And this created a self-fulfilling dynamic, right? That if you could see that government is doing all of these difficult things to maintain Taka, you would think that, okay, maybe Taka is actually up for a further depreciation. Now, the other backbone of Bangladesh economy is remittances. So depending on how you count and who's counted, there may be anywhere between 10 to 15 million Bangladeshis in the Middle East, in Europe, in the US, and so on, right? And they remit. And in fact, the other thing is that, if you look at the Gulf market, the largest destination, those markets are booming, and record number of people are actually going to the Middle East to work. So they remit. However, when they see that, look, the official rate is going from, 83 to 110, and then card market is going to 120, 125, and then in the black market, in this hundi or in this hawala, this kind of black market channels or informal channels who might even get 135, 140, right? What you do, you basically think that, okay, Taka is up for a fall, and I can make much more on those black markets, so I don't actually send money through the formal channels, right? So remittances, actually formal remittances, have actually been very weak in the last couple of years. So that then creates yet more depreciation pressure, which then government tries to stop by creating all of these other restrictions and restrictions on bank lending and so on, right? And this ultimately didn't work in the sense that the country had lost about half of its foreign reserves, and Taka had depreciated, depending on how you are counting, by 40%, 50%, right? And when the depreciation then happened, that then created even more inflationary pressure, right? So only in, last couple of months or last few months, the government has, or the authorities, Bangladesh Bank, has seriously taken the, standard macroeconomic prescriptions, which is let the Taka depreciate, or don't go for a free floating, because in a developing country context, free floating is probably not going to, it's probably going to overshoot. So, go for something like a crawling peg, allow the Taka to gradually depreciate, raise interest rates so that, there's the economy basically slows and you have slower demand for imports, and these things are probably working. My sense is that inflation probably would, all else being equal, as in assuming that there isn't another, escalation in the Middle East, for example, leaving those things aside, inflation probably should moderate over the course of 2024.
That's in. We talk about foreign exchange rates, like you mentioned, they did half to, I think, from 48 billion in 2021 to less than 20 billion in 2024.
That's right. Yeah.
So do you think, in collaboration with the IMF, we've seen Sri Lanka and Pakistan also take these big development loans. The new second tranche that has come is 689 million. How big of a role will this play in helping stabilize the Dhaka and helping ease the pressure on foreign reserves?
So the big difference between the Bangladeshi program and Pakistan and Sri Lanka program is the Sri Lanka program is very much a crisis program, right? Like, sort of they are in the throes of crisis and so on. And you could argue that it's same with Pakistan as well. In Bangladesh, the program actually has two elements. One is a precautionary, so it's not a crisis program as such, it's more a preventative program. And the other element is the climate fund. Right? So in Bangladesh's case, the IMF program, and it's not so much the amount itself, it's more the catalyzing effect of attracting other monies. Right? So for example, a lot of the climate funds that other agencies and other development partners bilaterally and multilaterally would commit to are directly or indirectly linked to the IMF funds. So, so for example, hypothetically, let's say, Canada wants to give some money, or any country you choose, right? They would probably say that, okay, look, we are going to give this climate, we're going to contribute to this climate pot, but would like to know that this country actually has a sound macro framework. How do I know that they have a good macro framework? Okay, IMF says, IMF is putting some of its money to them. So I can now go back and tell my parliament that, look, sort of, we want to give, sort of this money for the Bangladesh pot, as opposed to, say, Nepal pot, because Nepal doesn't have an IMF program, and therefore I don't know whether Nepal is, sort of doing sound macro framework kind of thing. So that's how I would see the IMF program. It's not the, sort of the $600 million in itself, because, sort of in the scheme of things, I mean, if the economy stabilizes, that amount of money probably would come through remittances and garments, sort of over the course of the year, right? So it's not the magnitude itself, it's more these additional things that are needed.
That's interesting, because if we look at the Bangladesh economy, because of the way it's been progressing, we've also in the last, I'd say, 10 years, seen the development of a lot of mega projects in Bangladesh.
Yes.
Very recently, Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina came out and said that Bangladesh has many uncompleted or stalled development projects, and she's asked the authorities to complete the ongoing developmental projects as early as possible and embark upon new schemes after proper scrutiny. So how can the Bangladesh government ensure that comprehensive and integrated planning for mega projects in Bangladesh, considering the feasibility and the socio-economic impact?
So if we go back about 15, 20 years ago, there were two engines of growth. There was the remittance and there was the RMG. This is a labor arbitrage story that we talked about earlier, right? The garment side is obviously clear, exports, but also that, like, a lot of people actually just went to work when there were jobs and they were sending money back. This development model was hitting the infrastructure bottleneck by, say, 2006, 2007, right? Power sector was one issue. Road transport sector was the other issue, right? Sort of the Dhaka's traffic jam is legend. Like, it's sort of it's nothing like anywhere else in the world. Okay, so sort of it's extremely slow, to put it bluntly, right? And the Chittagong port was pretty small, so sort of you cannot really have an export driven, foreign investment driven growth prospect until you tackle those things. There were twofold problem. One was, so the problem was not financing as such, right? Because development partners were willing to fund. And also, it's a good news story if you sort of if you help a country like Bangladesh develop. So sort of it wasn't financing. Financing itself was not the problem. The problem was one of governance, right? Like sort of these long-term projects, these infrastructure projects are big money generators, right? And you would want to ensure that like sort of these projects are done on low cost, or like, sort of manage the costs, that you avoid cost blow-ups and overruns and all of those things. At the same time, Bangladesh had these two political parties, and they, they were alternating in power, and like, on the wave of anti-incumbency and so on, like, sort of every election, sort of they would rotate. Not really all that different from many other parts of the subcontinent. The political economic model of the of Sheikh Hasina when she came back to power in 2009 was basically to tackle both infrastructure problems and the political problems with a deal. The deal was basically that, okay, look, sort of you offered the emerging business class that there would be all these mega projects, and these projects would be run by these business houses without scrutiny and without oversight. In return, they would basically, fund the political campaigns of the government. And that's what we have seen over the last 10, 15 years, right? So sort of these cost overruns, these, sort of sprawled mega projects, these are not, sort of bugs of the system. This was the system that was set up. How do you unwind this? Again, like, sort of to unwind something like this that is actually integral to the way the regime has sort of, or the way that Hasina government has maintained itself in power, basically would mean that, like, they would have to unwind a lot of, basically the fundamental political economy model. And that's not a technocratic fix. That's a political issue, fundamentally political issue. Right? Yeah.
If we're talking about development and mega projects, Bangladesh has been a part of China's flagship Belt and Road Initiative since, I think, about 2015 or 16 they signed on, or maybe even earlier.
Yeah.
We've seen, as you mentioned, Sri Lanka and Pakistan earlier, that other countries, due to maybe an excessive investment from China, you could say have fallen into a debt trap of sorts. Despite knowing this and this information being available, why do you think Bangladesh continues to be so heavily reliant on China? We've seen it with projects like the Padma Bridge and other projects, which have been successful. But as you've just mentioned, there are a lot of stalled projects right now. Why do you think Bangladesh is so reliant on China, knowing that this could maybe eventually lead to problems in the future?
So I would think of it as it's okay. So there is, on the one hand, there is a crucial difference between Pakistan and Sri Lanka versus Bangladesh. Whether by design or by accident, a lot of these projects that are actually happening in Bangladesh, even if you had very good governance programs and so on, you would probably choose the similar kind of things, right? So for example, sort of Padma Bridge it does connect a large part of the country in the south to Dhaka, right? The metro rail in Dhaka sort of does actually help with sort of traffic problems, right? Every day there's this something like 2.53 lakh people sort of taking those trains, right? And that's just basically one element, sort of one of the 6 different lines have been built, and we're already seeing people taking these things, right? In Pakistan, for example, sort of if you actually did a proper cost-benefit analysis and so on, you probably would not have set up a port in Gwadar from that kind of economic reason, right? Similarly, in Sri Lanka, you already have a nice big port in Colombo. You probably would not have set up another, big port from economic reasons. So that is one big thing. So in Bangladesh, yes, there are, these projects are hugely inefficient. There is huge corruption. There's huge cost overruns, and that money goes to the elite and all of that. Absolutely. And there are political games and all of that. Absolutely. Lack of scrutiny. However, these projects are still beneficial in the sense that they act, sort of they're being used, right? So in that sense, it's not so much that the country is going to be in debt trap to China as such. Rather, what's actually happening is a huge uh, redistribution within the country, where the rich is, sort of benefiting disproportionately from the investment. This could have been done much better in the sense that, like, this could have actually helped the economic growth and development much more had it been done in a more equitable way. That hasn't happened, right? But it still is going to generate return. It's just basically that the returns have gone to the top end of the town, so to speak, right? So that is one fundamental difference between Bangladesh and Pakistan. The other difference is that the debt levels are still much lower than in Pakistan and Sri Lanka. Right? So the public debt levels, particularly Sri Lanka. In Sri Lanka, it was already close to 80% of GDP even before COVID. Right? Whereas in Bangladesh, it's 40, 45, depending on which loans are counted, or which it's nowhere near as bad as that, right? So in that sense, the debt trap itself is probably not the imminent issue. The imminent issue, the issue really is that, look, at some point these bills need to be paid, right? And that basically means that, it would come from the taxpayers who are, and taxpayers in Bangladesh are not the rich. They are the, people, it's highly inequitable in that sense. So that's the development problem here.
But do you not see it as growing influence on maybe politics, Bangladeshi politics from China? For example, I've recently read that Bangladesh is urging China to open up one of their banks to facilitate the yuan trade in Bangladesh. And how do you think this recognition of Chinese currency in Bangladesh will impact the bilateral trade between the two countries, if so?
So in a sense that, using yuan, and for that matter using rupee or other currencies, in and of itself is probably not going to be all that big a deal, because Bangladesh has bilateral deficits with these countries, right? So for example, so basically, Bangladesh's external relations is the external economic relation is that the export markets are the West, and then import markets are either the Gulf for fuel, or India for a lot of agricultural products, for cereals and cotton and so on, and China for manufacturing, right? So in that sense, so currency composition, I don't think probably will make all that much difference, because ultimately you would need a lot more dollar than rupee or yuan, right? And that dollar is going to come from your exports and remittances. However, the political influence of China, so moving away from core economic issues to longer term political issues, this may well be a major factor. So one thing that is not particularly well appreciated outside Bangladesh is that Sheikh Hasina does not have any successor or heir apparent either in the government, as there is no deputy prime minister, or in the party, as in there is no deputy leader of Army League, and to put it bluntly, nor in the family. I mean, in the subcontinent, political families are nothing new, right? It's basically in all countries, in all states, even in many district level or local government level, you would have big families, right? In each of those cases, there is a script, right? So and so is the prime minister or the chief minister or the president or whatever, and then they have their their children or their brother or their, sort of wife or somebody who's, sort of a designated number two, and they do a lot of party things and all of that, right? Like, they maybe run the youth center or, organize this campaign or whatever, right? None of that exists in Bangladesh. So there is no mechanism. There's not only any successor, there is no succession mechanism in Bangladesh. So in this environment, and she is in her late 70s, she has had a traumatic life, and she's in her fourth consecutive term in office. So in that background, you could argue that what all of these Chinese loans and all of this Chinese investment and so on are buying is influence for a post-Hasina power struggle. So that is actually a factor that is not very well appreciated outside Bangladesh. In Bangladesh, you cannot talk about these things because of basically government would not allow you to talk about it. And outside Bangladesh, this is not very well appreciated at all. And that's probably where the biggest Chinese influence probably would come. I would say would come, I don't know, but that is a big conduit through which China could exert its influence over the longer term. Through those businessmen who are linked to all of these Chinese projects.
Sticking on Chinese influence, India and Bangladesh have always shared great bilateral ties, at least for many a year from independence onwards. The India-Bangladesh CEPA was announced in September of 2022 when Prime Minister Hasina had come to visit India. However, official negotiations have not started yet. How do you think growing Chinese influence will affect ties between India and Bangladesh? For example, if we look at the Teesta water sharing program, for example, if we use that.
So a lot of the nitty-gritty of bilateral relations with India, the outstanding issues such as this, the water sharing and so on, they probably have much more to do with the Indian domestic politics than on the Bangladesh side, right? So for example, Teesta itself is a major issue in Indian Bengal, right? And that is a, sort of depending on who you listen to, could be a big deciding factor in any election. I mean, like, sort of, if nothing else, there are what, 42 MPs in a 550 member house that come from West Bengal. So, sort of in any election, that's a big factor, right? So, so I suspect a lot of those Indian domestic factors are probably a lot more important in sort of those outstanding bilateral issues, rather than anything on the Bangladesh side or any Chinese influence as such. More broadly, the opening of Indian market for Bangladeshi goods, or things like transshipment and so on. These things in and of themselves are not going to generate as much return for economic development as one might expect, or like, one might superficially expect. And the reason for that is because at the end, again, like, if you think about the Bangladesh fundamental economic relationship, what does it export? It exports garments. And that market is not India, that market is the West. What does it import? It needs to import fuel, and it comes from the Middle East. It needs to import a lot of manufacturing. That does not come from India because India is not a manufacturing powerhouse itself. What does it import from India? Most of the things are actually cereals and agricultural products. And that makes sense because, sort of geographically, it's just next door, right? So, sort of if you're going to get, like, sort of, you need onions, right? You need eggplants. You need, sort of these things, right? And sort of food produced from just beyond the border versus food produced from the other side of the world. All else being equal, the laws of economics would suggest if you could, you would get it from next door, right? And that's what we actually see, right? So, and similarly, that, like, sort of things that India would import from Bangladesh, India doesn't, I mean, like, sort of buying Bangladeshi t-shirt is not, I mean, like, sort of, it's not immediately obvious that there is a market there, right? There is clearly a market in the West, but it's not so clear cut that there is a market for Bangladeshi products in India that is, I mean, sort of, yes, you could actually move the mile through a lot of these, sort of stumbling blocks. Sure, but they
Yeah.
are not going to be radical game changers. It's not like that, like, sort of, even if you had free mobility of goods, and even if you remove the border between the two countries in terms of, sort of economic sense, it's probably not going to fundamentally change things that we already see.
If we keep on talking about issues with neighboring countries, I think one of the biggest issues Bangladesh has been facing for a while now is the Rohingya refugee crisis. If we look right now in this moment, we see intensified border clashes between in Myanmar. There are close to, I'd say, 1 million Rohingya refugees living in Bangladesh right now. That number might be even more than 1 million.
Yeah.
How do you think Bangladesh as a country and its economy has been affected by this mass migration of Rohingya refugees? And how do you see this playing out? What do you think the best course of action is going forward? Do you think that's the repatriation back to Myanmar or how integration into Bangladesh? How do you see this playing out?
This is a very good question, and I wish I knew I had a good answer to this. I'm afraid I don't. I will explain why. So, in first question, that, like, sort of, how has this impacted the economy? The direct impact actually has not been as severe as one might expect. That, like, 1 million people come in, sort of big. There are two reasons for that. One is that Bangladesh has also received a sort of reasonable amount of international support, right? So in that sense, that, like, cost on the public finance has not been sort of severe, right? Because it's a humanitarian issue. It's well appreciated around the world that, look, this is not a rich country. This is still a very poor country. These are very poor people. There's sort of they need help and so on. In terms of the longer term solution, that ultimately has to do with how things play out in Myanmar, right? And that is look, that is anybody's guess, right? I mean, even today, I was reading that there are now, I think, like, sort of last night or the night before, in last few days, there are Myanmar army of personnel who have sought refuge in Bangladesh, right? Like, sort of rebels have captured some camps, and these, sort of these soldiers have crossed the border. I mean, like, this is not really something that, I mean, like, it seems that, like, the ground reality in Myanmar is changing very swiftly. And how that plays out is, frankly, sort of anybody's guess, right? Whatever the solution, whatever happens in that conflict would determine, what's the longer term solution for the Rohingya issues. One thing we know from refugee flows in other parts of the subcontinent, the longer a population stays in the host country, the harder it is to maintain. I mean, like, whatever you call it, sort of legally, the practical reality is that people just, I mean, sort of subcontinent is a very porous place, right? We know this from post-partition refugees across the subcontinent. We know this from the sort of Tibetans who came to India back in the 50s, right? We know this from flow of Tamil people in sort of in Sri Lanka's war. We know this from sort of cross-border migration between Bangladesh and India, for that matter, right? So the longer the Rohingya stay in Bangladesh, the harder it will be to, I mean, like, sort of, we may not call them, sort of, I mean, like, whatever the legal fictions, the ground reality is that people would integrate, because that's what has happened anywhere else in the subcontinent.
So we're approaching the 1 hour mark. So I have a couple more questions that I want to ask you before I'll open it up to anyone who's watching if they have any questions. So just a couple more questions, if that's okay, because I know it's getting late there as well.
Sure.
So if we look at Bangladesh, they're going to be upgraded from their least developed country status in 2026. So after that, going forward, they'll have to renegotiate with different regions and countries to establish different trade agreements. How do you think Bangladesh will fare after 2026 in relation to their ability to form maybe free trade agreements with Europe and likewise or like so?
Very poorly. So this is one of the things where the government Bangladesh has been, I would say that, like, sort of that they have not at all acted with the with the diligence that you would have expected from them. Again, if we compare it with, say, for example, Vietnam, right? So Vietnam was a founding negotiator for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, it's a different thing that, like, US, because of its own domestic politics, sort of did not happen. That's not Vietnam's fault, right? Yeah. Vietnam negotiated, or one of the first negotiators for TPP. They were very keen on that, right? Bangladesh is not, right? Bangladesh is not in TPP. It's not in RCEPA. It does not have bilateral free trade agreements with basically any major countries, right? And it's not that, like, they didn't know. It's not that we didn't know that this was something we needed to do. We knew, but we haven't done. So this is, I would say that as things stand currently, this would be a significant problem. And this is even before we get into the rising protectionism and nearshoring and anti-globalization backlash in the West and all of those things. Even without getting into those things, purely the fact that you stop being a poor country, as in you formally are no longer an LDC, you are now a middle income country, and therefore you don't have all of those concessional benefits. Purely from that perspective, Bangladesh is not prepared. On top of that, if you add these other problems, this could be a significant medium-term challenge in next 5 years or so. This is not going to affect the garments, because cost competitiveness in garments is probably still a long way to go. But it is going to affect moving beyond garments. Bangladesh cannot become a, never mind developed country, it cannot become even a solid middle income country. It cannot maintain its development trajectory by solely relying on garments. It has to move beyond garments. That's not going to happen unless, that's going to become much more difficult without these trade agreements. And the government is not, the country is not ready. It's not prepared.
That's interesting to see. So you think maybe in the future Bangladesh will face more problems under this current government going forward after 2026 in the future?
So in this sense, the trade issues is basically that, like, if the trade issues are not, so specifically the trade question that, like, after 2026, there is a vacuum in trade regime that needs to be addressed, right? If we want to move beyond garments. But also that like, moving beyond garments require all of those other things that we talked about, that, like, you need to attract investment, and just setting up a special economic zone is not going to get you there, because, it's not the same thing as it was in China, right? So that basically means that you would need to invest on education, you need to invest on skilling, you need to, invest on those things, right? Human capital, right? And that requires fundamentally tax reform, because ultimately that's not the kind of stuff that, like, you are going to get development money from, right? So there isn't any global human capital. There is climate pot of money. Even if we don't do anything for our taxes, we'll still get money for climate change. But nobody's going to give us money so that we can, improve our workforce. And if we don't have a upskilled workforce, we're not going to get foreign investment. So Those kind of things require us, the government, Bangladesh to generate its own domestic revenue. And that requires political commitment. So on those things, I would say that unless there is a fundamental change in the politics, it's going to require, the medium term does not look as good as the last 10, 15, 20, 30 years.
That's interesting. I'd like to get into one final topic, if you wouldn't mind, to ask you about. Nobel Prize winner Muhammad Yunus, he's talk of the town right now in Bangladesh, and also it's garnered a lot of international attention. The charges that have been brought against him, the allegations. Before we get into that, what do you think of microcredit as a concept, and do you think it's helped in alleviating poverty in Bangladesh? Because if we look at what Muhammad Yunus himself had said maybe 20, 30 years ago, he had said, I want to turn poverty into a museum. How close do you think he's come to doing this?
So the idea of microcredit, when started back then, back in the 80s and so on, and all the way until sort of in the 90s and so on, was that you give poor people money and they would take that money and they would sort of they would start their own business or so on, and then that's how they would get out of poverty, right? What we now know, so leaving aside the politics and all of that, right? Like, what economic research by, for example, people like Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo and Michael Kremer and others, right? Like, sort of, they also won Nobel Prize, by the way, for this, right? What we now know is that not everybody is going to become an entrepreneur. And that is true whether you are poor or whether you are rich, right? Or whether you're affluent, right? A lot of people go to university and get education, and then they prefer to have a stable 9-to-5 job because entrepreneurship is risky and people are risk averse. This is true for poor as well. So microcredit has helped people, the literature, the economic literature, when people actually have done this as rigorously as you could in economics, not just in Bangladesh, but around the world. What the literature suggests is that microcredit helps the poor mitigate adverse shocks. Okay, you have had a flood, you have lost your cow, your husband died, or your kids died, or whatever, and microcredit is the thing that helped you get over those big negative shocks. And that's a good thing. If not for microcredit, you might have gone from poverty to destitution and hunger. Now you have microcredit, you avoided those really dire, really bad outcomes. And some people took advantage of that and built a better life for themselves. But many didn't. Not because that sort of the not because that microcredit doesn't work. It's just that microcredit doesn't do what people thought it would. It has benefited in keeping people afloat, but it's not a development driver, because most people are not entrepreneurs. Most people would prefer to have a stable life where, just like you and me, we would much rather have a job and do things sort of, rather than sort of go and come up with a sort of a new business venture and go on to become a millionaire.
So just last thing I'd like to say, finish by saying is, as you said, Sheikh Hasina, Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, this is a fourth consecutive term. In the lead up to the election, we saw a lot of interest from Western countries, the US, Europe. After the election, the US stated that they believed the election was not free and fair. But more recently, we have seen President Joe Biden came out and said that he's expressed his willingness to essentially work with the Sheikh Hasina government in Bangladesh going forward. How much do you think that all of the talk before the election has actually impacted things going forward? Because now we've seen all the other countries and Western powers, they've seemed to have come back to the status quo of being like, yes, we are willing to work with Bangladesh and so on. So do you think it's had really much of an impact going forward for Western?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the way I see it is that one thing that nobody, whether it's the West or China or India, wants is instability in Bangladesh, right? So again, we're talking about 170 million people by official counts. 90% of them are Muslim. Until now, the economic issues notwithstanding, this has been a more of a development success than failure, right? I mean, like, if you look at Bangladesh in the 70s, that was a sort of a really truly human catastrophe. Nobody wants to go back to that. In fact, nobody even wants, given what's happening in Pakistan and Sri Lanka, or what has happened in Pakistan and Sri Lanka, nobody even wants a repeat of that in Bangladesh. Right? So whether, again, like, sort of, and this is probably something that's common between India, China, and the US, or the West. However, given the structural problems in the country, given that the structural problem in the politics, in that, like, Hasina does not have a succession mechanism at all, right? There is a significant risk that instability is around the corner. So arguably, US particularly, and other Western countries thought that a democratic election or some form of democratic election is probably the best antidote to instability, because nobody benefits from instability. The second part to this is probably that as things stand, China probably has the most inroads into a post-Hasina politics in Bangladesh. Why? Because of the factors we talked about, through the large business houses, through a lot of Chinese-funded projects. Like, sort of, those are the actual channels. Now West is or the US is in a bind, or it's in a quandary, right? The election has happened. What should they do? Should they push Hasina, punish Hasina for not allowing a free and fair election? And it wasn't a free and fair election. Like, there wasn't an election at all. Basically, it was a one-party show, and everybody knows that, right? What do? Do you actually punish the government for doing that? And if you did that, then you are actually risking potentially the very instability that you don't want to have, right? Because you don't want instability. So that is the bind, or that is the dilemma that the US faces, right? How this unfolds, that's that's anybody's guess, right? Because the other thing is that, like, Hasina herself has led to this situation where again, not just that there isn't any democratic alternative, but also that within the regime there isn't any mechanism to avoid future instability. So in that sense, it's actually not it's a pretty uncertain. To use the Donald Rumsfeld's words, it's a known unknown. We know that this is a problem we're going to face. We don't know how we're going to resolve this.
That's interesting. I see we've crossed the 1 hour mark now. It's about 1 hour 10 minutes. I think I've taken up a lot of your time, sir. Thank you, sir, for taking the time today. I know it is late there, but I think I've learned a lot. I've worked on Bangladesh as well, so it's nice to get a different perspective and viewpoints of someone who is from Bangladesh. So thank you for today's conversation, sir.
Thank you for the questions, and thank you for the discussion. Thank you for having me. Thank you. Okay.
Maybe we can do this again in the future. Bye.
Maybe, of course, I would like that. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.